The day had started like any other in the city. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the streets that were slowly coming alive with the hum of cars and chatter of people starting their routines. She had been on duty for a few hours already, handling routine tasks and keeping an eye on the flow of the neighborhood. She moved with purpose, calm and collected, her uniform crisp and her badge clearly visible. She had been trained for moments like this, moments where patience and composure mattered more than anything else. The streets were filled with the usual sounds, but amid the normal rhythm of the city, a tension began to build. A man in uniform, clearly a police officer but with an air of arrogance that was impossible to ignore, had been moving through the same area. There was something off about him. He walked with a sense of entitlement, his eyes scanning the surroundings as though he owned the space. He noticed her first, and his expression twisted into something that was both mocking and threatening. She had seen arrogance before, but something about this situation made her instinctively aware that it could escalate quickly. Their eyes met, and there was a silent tension that seemed to freeze the world for a brief moment. She stood her ground, her posture firm, her hand lightly resting near her belt where her communication device was. He, on the other hand, seemed to relish the confrontation. He raised his hand slightly, not in greeting, but in a manner that suggested he was preparing to assert dominance. And then it happened. He drew his gun and pointed it at her. The movement was abrupt and shocking, leaving little room for immediate reaction. Those nearby froze, unsure whether to intervene or step back, their hearts racing. She didn't panic. She didn't yell or draw her own weapon. Instead, she held her hands in a calm, non-threatening position and spoke, her voice steady. She identified herself clearly, stating her name and position, and reminded him that she was a colleague in uniform, just like him. The words hung in the air, precise and firm. Yet the officer laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh, nor one that signaled relief. It was mocking, dismissive, and filled with disbelief that someone in a similar position could challenge him. People around started to notice. A few had their phones out, recording the scene. Some whispered to each other, shocked by what they were witnessing. The city's morning life seemed to pause around them. The officer's laughter echoed, a strange sound against the usual rhythm of traffic and distant construction noises. He shook his head, almost in disbelief that she could hold her ground. His expression suggested he thought the situation was amusing, a joke at her expense. She remained composed. Her training had prepared her for this, but more importantly, her experience had taught her that reacting emotionally would only escalate the danger. She maintained eye contact, her voice calm but firm, and continued to assert her authority and identity. The laughter didn't faze her. She knew that the badge she wore symbolized not just authority but accountability. She knew that any misstep by him could be caught and recorded, and she made sure to keep her own actions measured, precise, and above reproach. Witnesses continued to gather discreetly, sensing the gravity of the moment. One man, standing a few feet away, could barely believe what he was seeing. He whispered to the person next to him about how the officer was acting and how the woman wasn't backing down. Another person in a nearby cafe quietly recorded the scene, realizing that this was something that could not be ignored. Their recordings and observations would later become critical, though none of them knew it at that moment. Meanwhile, the officer seemed to oscillate between mockery and frustration. It was as if he could not comprehend that someone could remain calm in such a threatening situation. He waved the gun slightly, almost as if showing it off, as if it were a tool of intimidation rather than a device meant for protection and law enforcement. The laugh escaped again, louder this time, drawing more attention from passers-by. Some froze in fear, unsure if they should intervene or leave, while others whispered warnings to keep distance. She continued to speak, reminding him again of who she was, and importantly asking him to lower his weapon. She kept her words simple, clear, and authoritative. She did not shout, she did not gesture wildly, she simply stated the facts. They were both professionals, and there was no reason for this escalation. Her voice carried over the murmurs of the small crowd gathering around them. It was calm, but it cut through the tension like a sharp knife. The officer, however, was not listening. His behavior was erratic now, swinging between amusement and irritation. It was clear that he felt challenged in a way he had not anticipated. He laughed again, a hollow sound, and made a comment under his breath that only added to the tension. People nearby exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if the situation would turn violent or if it would defuse on its own. The city seemed to hold its breath, the normal sounds of traffic and chatter fading into the background. She did not falter. She carefully documented the situation, speaking into her radio to ensure that her superiors were aware of the confrontation. She described the location, the behavior of the officer, and the fact that she was being threatened with a firearm. Every word was measured, every action precise. She was aware that her composure could influence not only the outcome, but also the perception of those around her. The tension was palpable. Pedestrians watched from a distance, their phones recording, their expressions a mixture of fear, concern, and fascination. The officer's mockery continued, but now it was beginning to lose its edge. The more he laughed, the more visible his irrational behavior became. The more she remained calm, the stronger her position seemed. It was a strange contrast. One person fueled by arrogance and aggression, the other by discipline and calm authority. As the moments passed, it became increasingly clear that the situation was not going to resolve itself without intervention. The woman's focus never wavered. She was aware of the power dynamics, but she also knew the importance of maintaining her professionalism. She didn't lower her hands, didn't retreat, and certainly didn't raise her voice unnecessarily. Her presence was a statement in itself, a reminder that authority comes with responsibility, and that reckless behavior has consequences. The officer, still laughing, finally began to notice the growing attention from bystanders and the subtle murmurs of concern. There was a slight hesitation, a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a smirk. He believed that his position and weapon gave him the upper hand, that the moment was still under his control. But every second that passed was a reminder that accountability was closing in, even if he couldn't see it yet. The scene continued, a tense standoff that seemed both surreal and frightening. She remained unwavering, a figure of calm determination in the middle of a chaotic and unnerving moment. Witnesses continued to record, their devices silently capturing every gesture, every word, every laugh, and every measured response. The stage was set, the tension thick, and the moment that would soon change everything was quietly building, invisible to those who had not yet realized the significance of what was unfolding. Even as the officer finally lowered his weapon slightly, his smirk remained. He did not yet understand that his actions were being documented, that every laugh, every gesture, and every dismissive comment would soon be his undoing. She continued to speak into her radio, her voice steady, her mind focused on keeping herself safe and ensuring that the situation could be properly recorded and assessed. The contrast between them was stark, one fueled by arrogance, the other by controlled professionalism. The city continued around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding in one small corner. Traffic continued to move. People walked past and the sun climbed higher in the sky. But in that small space, time seemed suspended. The tension, the fear, and the courage all existed in a fragile bubble, ready to burst into the consequences that were inevitable. Every laugh from the officer only tightened the noose of accountability around him. Every calm word from her reinforced the professionalism and control she wielded so naturally. It was in this charged atmosphere that the first part of the story unfolded. A confrontation that started with arrogance and threat, a calm response from someone in authority, and the eyes of the city quietly watching, recording, and witnessing a moment that would not be forgotten. The air was thick with tension, the possibility of danger real, and the stark contrast between recklessness and discipline evident to all who had the courage to look closely. And as the moments passed, it became clear that what was happening was just the beginning, that the story would soon take turns no one could have predicted, but that professionalism, courage, and accountability were quietly laying the foundation for what was to come. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. As the moments stretched longer than they should have, she stayed calm, every breath measured, every motion careful. Around her, the crowd was growing quietly, the distance between them shrinking as curiosity and concern pulled people closer. Some had phones out, others just watched, their eyes wide and voices low, whispering among themselves. No one wanted to provoke the situation, but everyone felt the weight of it, the seriousness that it carried. She could hear herself think clearly. Despite the threat, despite the mockery, she could hear herself think clearly despite the threat, despite the mockery. Her training guided her every action. She knew that staying calm was not only for her own safety, but also for the safety of those watching. She carefully moved a hand toward her radio again, pressing the button just enough to ensure her words could be heard. Her report clear. She described exactly what was happening, who was involved, what the officer had done, and where she was located. Every detail mattered, and she knew the recordings and reports would be essential later. The officer, still holding his gun, laughed again, though this time the sound was tinged with frustration. Something about the calmness of the woman seemed to unsettle him. He glanced around, noticing the growing attention of the witnesses, though he tried to dismiss it. A few people stepped back, sensing danger, but others lingered, holding their phones as silent proof of what was unfolding. Each recording, each whisper, each glance at the scene was quietly shaping the evidence that would soon be undeniable. She continued to speak clearly, instructing the officer to lower his weapon. She did so without shouting, without raising her voice unnecessarily. Her calm authority contrasted sharply with his aggressive behavior. Each word she spoke was deliberate, steady, meant to remind him and the bystanders of the proper conduct expected in a situation like this. She reminded him of their shared role in law enforcement, stressing professionalism, responsibility, and the importance of following protocol. He waved the gun slightly, more out of nervous habit than confidence now. It was clear he was beginning to understand that this situation was slipping from his control. Yet he laughed again, trying to maintain some appearance of dominance. It was a laugh that made no one feel at ease, and it drew more attention from those around. The woman did not flinch. She kept her eyes on him, her words calm, her body language composed. The contrast was striking. One person consumed by arrogance and fear, the other grounded in professionalism and calm clarity. A young man at the edge of the growing crowd whispered to his friend, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He could not believe that an officer would aim a gun at someone like this and laugh. Another person who had stepped out of a nearby shop quietly recorded the scene. She was aware of the risk, but she also knew that documenting such behavior could be critical. Every movement of the officer, every word he uttered, was now captured not just in her memory, but in multiple digital records that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, she continued to handle the situation with unwavering focus. Her voice was clear, calm, and precise. She repeated her request for him to lower the weapon, emphasizing the need for safety and professional behavior. She ensured that her own actions were beyond reproach, that her demeanor remained firm but non-threatening. She had learned that maintaining composure in such moments could prevent escalation and protect everyone involved. The officer shifted his stance, perhaps realizing that his mockery was no longer amusing. The growing attention from the crowd, the steady words of the woman, and the silent documentation surrounding him began to weigh on his confidence. Yet he tried to mask it with laughter, attempting to retain some semblance of control. Each passing moment, however, chipped away at the illusion of authority he had tried to project. The crowd, now more aware of the tension, whispered among themselves. Some commented on the bravery of the woman, noting her calmness under such direct threat. Others speculated about the officer, noting his unprofessional behavior and apparent lack of judgment. The contrast was evident to everyone watching: professionalism against recklessness, courage against arrogance. The energy in the air was electric, but there was also a sense that justice, or at least accountability, was quietly building around the scene. She continued speaking into her radio, ensuring that her report was detailed and precise. She described not only the actions of the officer but also the context, the location, the people around, and the exact nature of the threat. Her words were steady, deliberate, and purposeful, designed to ensure that her perspective would be clear and that the evidence of the incident would be irrefutable. Every detail mattered. Every description was crucial. The officer, now beginning to realize the gravity of his actions, showed signs of frustration. He glanced at the crowd, then back at her, his confidence wavering. He tried to laugh again, but the sound was weaker, less convincing. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the tension evident in every movement. It was clear that he was struggling to maintain control, that the situation was no longer as easy or humorous as he had imagined. She remained calm throughout, her composure never faltering. Her eyes were steady, her hands relaxed but ready, her words measured. She was aware of the power dynamics, aware that any sudden movement or escalation could change everything. But she also knew that by remaining calm, She was asserting control in the most effective way possible. Her professionalism was her strength, her shield, and her tool for ensuring safety. As the minutes passed, the attention of the witnesses grew more intense. People quietly recorded every movement, every word, every gesture. Their silent documentation created a web of evidence that surrounded the officer, a web that he could no longer ignore. He could feel the weight of observation pressing down on him, even as he tried to laugh it off. The tension between them became more than just a personal confrontation. It became a public display of accountability in real time. She continued to speak, her voice calm but insistent. She repeated the request for him to lower his weapon, emphasizing that there was no need for escalation and that professionalism demanded respect and safety. Her words carried authority, not just because of her position, but because of the unwavering confidence in her demeanor. She was not confrontational. She was measured, controlled, and deliberate. The officer's laughter had lost its force. He looked around, noticing the growing crowd and the silent recordings. The realization began to sink in that this was no longer a private confrontation. Every action was being documented, every gesture noticed. His attempt to assert dominance through mockery and threat was failing, and he could sense the shift in control. The woman's calm authority, combined with the attention of witnesses, was slowly turning the situation against him. The scene continued with both tension and clarity. She remained composed, maintaining her professionalism in the face of mockery and threat. The officer, now visibly uneasy, began to hesitate, his arrogance diminishing as the reality of accountability closed in. The witnesses continued to watch quietly, aware that they were witnessing an event that carried significance beyond the immediate moment. The recordings, whispers, and attentive eyes created a framework of evidence and moral observation that could not be ignored. She continued to manage the situation, her voice calm, her body language measured, her every movement intentional. She ensured that her actions were above reproach and that her presence alone communicated authority and control. The contrast between her composure and his increasingly erratic behavior was stark, and it was impossible for anyone observing not to notice. The crowd felt the tension, the fear, the courage, and the quiet assertion of professionalism in real time. As time passed, it became clear that this was not a moment that would fade quickly. The calmness of the woman, the erratic behavior of the officer, and the silent observation of the witnesses had created a scene that would resonate long after the immediate confrontation ended. Every word, every gesture, every recorded moment added to the weight of accountability that was building around the officer. He could no longer hide behind mockery or arrogance. The eyes of the city were upon him, and the calm professionalism of the woman was the force that would define the outcome of this encounter. By the end of these tense minutes, it was evident that the situation had reached a turning point. The officer, despite his attempts to mock and threaten, was being held in check by the steady authority of the woman, the growing attention of witnesses, and the undeniable presence of documentation. The calm, measured, and professional approach of the woman was not just keeping herself safe. It was quietly ensuring that accountability and justice were ready to follow immediately, once the moment allowed. The stage was set, and the unfolding story had moved beyond a simple confrontation into a public display of courage, professionalism, and the inevitability of consequences. The street was still tense. The woman could feel every heartbeat echo in the quiet that followed. The officer had lowered his gun slightly, but the damage was already done. His laughter had turned uneasy, and the confident smirk that once sat on his face was fading fast. He looked around, seeing more people with their phones pointed toward him. Every lens was a reminder that his actions could not be hidden. Every second he stood there, his authority slipped further away. She stayed where she was, calm and composed. Her breathing was steady, her eyes never leaving his. She knew that one wrong move could turn the situation dangerous again, but she also understood that fear had no place here. Her strength came from her composure. She didn't need to raise her voice or show anger. Her calmness was power in itself. It spoke louder than any weapon. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few people, who had been reviewing the footage. He looked serious, but there was also something like quiet respect in his eyes. When he finished watching, he leaned back and let out a long breath. "You handled that perfectly," he said in a steady voice. She nodded softly, not saying much. She didn't feel proud, not exactly. What she felt was relief, that no one was hurt, and that the truth was plain for everyone to see. Outside the office, a few younger officers whispered as she passed. Some looked at her with admiration, others with curiosity. It wasn't every day that something like this happened, and certainly not in such a public way. She wasn't seeking attention, though. She just wanted things to be handled fairly. The system would decide what came next. She had done her part. Meanwhile, the officer who had pointed the gun sat alone in a separate room. His head was down, his uniform wrinkled, and his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The arrogance that once filled his face was gone. He knew the investigation had already started. The cameras didn't lie, and neither did the crowd that had watched him that day. Every angle, every word, every laugh, everything was recorded. There was no way to escape it now. A senior investigator entered the room and placed a small folder on the table. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone carried weight. "You've been in this job long enough to know what comes next," he said quietly. The officer didn't look up. He didn't argue. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The investigator continued. "You aimed your weapon at a fellow officer without cause. You mocked her. You laughed. You put civilians at risk." His words were slow, deliberate. Each one landed heavy in the quiet room. The man nodded, his voice barely a whisper when he spoke. "I didn't think," he began but stopped himself. There wasn't much to explain. The truth was clear. He had let his ego take control, and now the weight of that mistake was crashing down on him. The investigator didn't respond right away. He simply looked at him, disappointment written all over his face. "That's the problem," he finally said. "You didn't think." Back in her office, the woman was going over her report for the final time. Every word mattered, and she wanted to make sure it reflected exactly what had happened. She didn't exaggerate or soften any details. She just told the truth. As she typed the last few lines, a quiet knock came at the door. It was one of her colleagues. He stepped inside slowly, hesitating before speaking. "Everyone's talking about it," he said softly. "What you did out there, it took courage." She looked up from her report, her expression thoughtful. "I just did my job," she replied simply. "That's what we're trained for." He nodded, though his eyes showed something more. Respect, perhaps even a little inspiration. "Still," he said, "not everyone would have stayed that calm." She smiled faintly but didn't respond. There wasn't much to say. In her mind, doing what was right shouldn't be extraordinary. It should be normal. By morning, the story had spread beyond the station. The clips from that day were now circulating widely online. News outlets had begun to pick it up, framing it as a story about professionalism and accountability. Headlines spoke of an officer's calm response under pressure. The video, though short, had sparked conversations about restraint, about respect, and about the power of calm authority. The faces of those involved were blurred in most of the videos, but people could still see the contrast clearly. The recklessness of one officer and the composure of another. At the station, things moved quickly. The internal affairs team completed their review of the footage and interviews. The evidence was overwhelming. The officer's laughter, the drawn gun, the witnesses, and the videos all told the same story. There was no way around it. That afternoon, a meeting was called. Senior officers, investigators, and department heads gathered in a small conference room. The tension was thick. The woman was asked to join them briefly to recount the events one last time. She spoke clearly with the same calmness she had shown that day. Her words carried no bitterness or anger. She simply described what happened. When she was finished, she was thanked and asked to wait outside. Inside the room, the discussion was short. There was no disagreement about what needed to happen. The behavior displayed by the officer was inexcusable, and the department had to respond immediately. Minutes later, the decision was made. The officer would be dismissed effective immediately. There was silence in the room as the paperwork was signed. It was a heavy decision, but a necessary one. Respect for the badge depended on accountability, and this moment was proof of that. When the woman was called back in, she didn't celebrate or smile. She simply nodded as she was told the outcome. Justice had been done, quietly and properly. Later that day, the officer was informed of his dismissal. The investigator who had spoken to him earlier returned with a final notice. He read it out loud, his voice even and steady. "Your actions on duty violated department conduct. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position." The words hung in the air. The man sat still, staring at the table. There was no argument, no protest. Just silence. He knew it was coming. He stood slowly, nodded once, and walked out of the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hallway. The woman saw him as he left the building. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in hers, only a quiet understanding that choices have consequences. He looked away quickly, his head down, and continued walking until he disappeared from view. She turned back toward her desk, feeling a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't satisfaction or relief, it was something quieter. A recognition that justice had been done, but also that a life had been changed forever because of a moment of arrogance and poor judgment. That evening, the department released a short statement to the press. It was formal and direct, confirming that the incident had been reviewed and that appropriate action had been taken. It praised the professionalism displayed during the event without naming anyone. The public response was immediate. People praised the department for acting quickly. Some commended the woman for her calm and restraint. Others discussed how important it was for such accountability to exist. At home that night, she sat by the window, looking out at the quiet city lights. It had been a long few days. She replayed the events in her mind again, this time with less tension and more reflection. There was no pride in what had happened, only a quiet sense of purpose. She thought about how easily things could have gone wrong, how one more moment of anger or panic could have changed everything. She was grateful that it hadn't. The next morning, as she arrived at the station, a few of her colleagues greeted her differently. Their nods carried more weight now, a sign of respect rather than routine acknowledgement. One of them said quietly, "You showed us something important." She smiled politely, replying, "We all have that in us. We just have to remember it." Those words lingered long after she walked away. Over the following days, the department held a short briefing for all officers, using the incident as a teaching moment. It wasn't about shame or blame, but about learning. They talked about control, about decision-making under pressure, and about the importance of mutual respect among officers. Her story became part of that conversation, not as a source of drama, but as an example of how professionalism could diffuse even the most dangerous moments. Meanwhile, the online attention continued. Messages of support poured in from people who had seen the video. Many thanked her for showing calmness and courage. She didn't respond publicly to any of it. She wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She believed that her actions should speak for themselves, not her words. As the days turned into weeks, the incident slowly faded from the headlines, but it left a lasting mark within the department. Officers began to talk more openly about accountability, about the importance of treating everyone, including fellow officers, with respect. Her composure had reminded them that the badge was not just a symbol of authority, but also of duty and discipline. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave the station, her supervisor stopped her by the door. "You did more than handle a bad situation," he said quietly. "You reminded people what this job is really about." She paused for a moment, unsure how to respond. Finally, she said softly, "If that's true, then it was worth it." He nodded, and she walked out into the sunlight, feeling a quiet peace settle over her. In the end, it wasn't about the punishment or the headlines. It was about something deeper, the belief that calmness, respect, and professionalism could still stand firm in a world that too often rewarded aggression. She had faced something dangerous and unfair, but she had refused to meet it with anger. Instead, she met it with control, reason, and courage. And in doing so, she had changed more than just one situation. She had reminded everyone watching that strength doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from staying calm when it matters most. Weeks passed after the incident, and life at the station slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The atmosphere was quieter, more thoughtful. The event had left a mark that no one could ignore. People carried themselves differently, spoke with more care, and listened more closely when others spoke. It was as if everyone had been reminded of the weight that came with wearing the uni. For me, the woman at the center of it all continued her work quietly, not seeking any special attention. She was the same as before, steady and focused, though her presence now carried a quiet power. One morning she arrived early, the sun still low in the sky. The air outside was crisp and calm. She parked her car, took a deep breath, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the station buzzed with the usual morning activity. Officers checking assignments, phones ringing, coffee being poured. But as she passed through, a few people paused to nod or smile. It wasn't the kind of attention she had ever wanted, but she understood it came from respect, not curiosity. Her supervisor called her into his office a few minutes later. He was an older man with years of experience behind him, someone who had seen all sides of the job, the good, the bad, and everything in between. He gestured for her to sit. "There's been a lot of discussion lately," he began, "about how we can learn from what happened." She nodded, waiting quietly. "We've decided to hold a department-wide workshop," he continued. "We want you to speak at it." She looked surprised. "Me?" she asked softly. He nodded. "You handled yourself with calm and discipline when things could have gone very wrong. People can learn from that. Not just officers, but everyone." She hesitated for a moment. She had never been the kind of person to stand in front of a crowd and talk about herself, but she also knew how much the message mattered. After a brief pause, she agreed. The day of the workshop came quickly. The main hall of the department was filled with officers from all divisions. Some she knew well, others she had only seen in passing. The chief spoke first, addressing the importance of accountability and composure. Then he introduced her. As she walked to the front, the room grew silent. She wasn't sure what to say at first. She looked out at the faces in front of her, men and women who had all taken the same oath to serve and protect. "I don't have a long speech prepared," she began in a calm voice. "I just want to share what I've learned." She paused, letting the quiet settle before continuing. "That day, when I was faced with something unexpected, I didn't have time to think about how it would look or who was watching. I just focused on staying calm, because in this job, our reactions can change everything. The difference between control and chaos can be just one decision." She looked around the room, making eye contact with a few of the officers. "We all wear the same badge," she said softly. "But that badge means nothing if we don't live up to what it stands. For respect, responsibility, integrity, we can't expect others to trust us if we don't hold ourselves accountable first." The room remained quiet, everyone listening closely. That day could have ended in tragedy. I'm grateful it didn't. But it reminded me, and maybe all of us, that every moment matters. When she finished, the hall erupted in quiet applause. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but genuine. Officers nodded to her as she stepped down, and a few even came up afterward to thank her. One said, "I've been on the job 15 years, and I needed to hear that." Another added, "You reminded us what this badge should mean." She smiled politely, grateful that her words had resonated. After the workshop, life continued, but things truly did begin to shift. The department started implementing new training sessions focused on de-escalation, empathy, and communication. The incident had sparked something larger than anyone expected, a quiet reform that didn't come from pressure or scandal, but from reflection. Officers began holding each other to higher standards. Conversations that once might have been brushed aside were now taken seriously. For the woman, this change brought a sense of peace. She never wanted attention, but she was glad that something good had come from what had happened. She noticed that newer recruits often looked to her for guidance. When they asked for advice, she always gave the same answer: "Never let emotion take control. Your calm is your greatest strength." Those words became a quiet mantra around the station. One afternoon, as she was finishing her shift, a younger officer approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, "I wasn't here when that incident happened, but I've heard about it. I just wanted to say, it made me want to do better. I joined this job to help people, not to intimidate them. You showed us what that really looks like." She smiled softly, touched by his sincerity. "That's what matters most," she said gently. "Remember that and you'll do fine." As months passed, the city also took notice. The department's quick action had earned public trust, something that had been fragile before. Community leaders invited her to speak at local meetings about trust and respect between officers and citizens. She didn't see herself as a public figure, but she understood the value of sharing her experience. Each time she spoke, she emphasized the same message, that true authority comes from understanding, not fear. One evening, after one such meeting, she walked through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold as the sun set. She thought about how much had changed in just a few months. The anger and fear from that day had given way to something better. Understanding, accountability, growth. She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as someone who had simply done what was right, even when it wasn't easy. At home, she kept a small folder tucked away in a drawer. Inside were the reports from the incident, a few newspaper clippings, and a printed email from someone she didn't know, a civilian who had witnessed everything that day. The message was short. Thank you for showing calm when others couldn't. You reminded me that there are still good people wearing that badge. Every once in a while, when the days felt long or difficult, she would read it again. It reminded her that one moment of courage could reach farther than she ever imagined. The officer who had been dismissed moved away quietly. No one heard much about him after that. Some said he found work in a different field, others didn't know. She didn't carry any resentment toward him. In her heart, she hoped he had learned from what happened. Everyone makes mistakes, she thought, but not everyone gets a second chance to correct them. Maybe in his own way, he was trying to become better too. The department continued to grow stronger. The new training program spread to other divisions, even to neighboring districts. It became a quiet movement, one rooted in the lessons learned that day. Her story was often mentioned, not by name, but as an example of how calmness and integrity could turn a dangerous moment into a teaching one. It was something people could look to and say, that's how it should be done. 1 year after the incident, the department held a small ceremony to honor officers who had shown exceptional professionalism. She was among those recognized. As she stood before her peers, she felt the same calm she had that day, but this time it was different. It wasn't about survival or reaction, it was about reflection. The chief spoke about her strength and how her actions had inspired change. When he handed her the plaque, she accepted it quietly and said, "Thank you, but this isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who believes in doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Later, as the ceremony ended and people began to leave, she stood for a moment, watching the others smile and talk. There was a sense of unity she hadn't seen before. It wasn't about fear or authority. It was about respect, the kind that could only come from shared understanding. That made her heart feel light. When she finally stepped outside, the night was cool and still. She looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. What had begun as a frightening encounter had become something much greater. It had shown the power of calm, the strength of integrity, and the importance of standing firm without anger. She knew that she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. "Thank you for everything you've done." She typed back a simple reply. "We all did this together." Then she put her phone away and drove home, the city lights glowing softly in the distance. The story that had once been about confrontation had turned into one about growth, respect, and quiet strength. And that, she thought, was exactly how it should end.